but with a new type of contract, there's a lot to talk about. Let's talk some Chiefs, guys. Welcome to the Chief of the North on RGR Football. I am Seth Kaiser, Minnesota Chiefs fan, the Chief of the North, the guy who has way too much to talk about and is probably going to take too long to do it. So we are here every Tuesday now. Remember, it's Tuesdays to talk about all things Chief and everything that I'm looking at on the Chief of the North newsletter. There's a lot going on right now. Normally I do a really long-winded introduction, and I probably will again, because that's just who I am at heart. But there's a lot going on right now in Chiefs Kingdom. Obviously, they dropped their first game of the year to the Detroit Lions in a really unfortunate performance. I'm going to talk about some of the things that went on with the wide receivers beyond the obvious in terms of drops. There were some concerns that were noted about spacing and that sort of thing. And so I actually went back, and while I charted Patrick Mahomes snaps, as I do every week, this week I actually made sure to take a look at every single pass catcher and take some notes on how they were doing as well, so that you, dear Chiefs fans, don't have to. And I'm also going to talk about, obviously, Chris Jones' new contract, which is another thing that I just wrote about today in the Chief of the North newsletter. But first, as ever, your mailbag questions, because they matter to me. As always, if you want to ask a mailbag question, you put it in the comment section below, put a question mark in front of it so I can identify it a little bit easier. I'll try to find ones that don't have it, but I might miss it because I'm only human. So we're going to try to get through those quickly. We're going to talk about the wide receivers and tight ends that I reviewed now that the All-22 is out in terms of what happened against the Lions. Beyond the drops, I'll probably talk about the drops a little too. And then I do want to talk a little bit about Chris Jones's contract now that more of the details are out. That's probably something you've maybe heard me talk about elsewhere, but now that we know the details are out, I really dove deep on the newsletter, kind of talking about how it's really hard to view this as anything other than a huge loss for Chris Jones in a lot of ways. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But first, let's talk about some actual football. I had someone ask based on last week's, Matt Francis asked, based on last week's video, do you think there's still a big difference between 43 and 34 alignments on defense? Your comments seem to suggest perhaps not. It just depends on how you're aligning it. You know, are you playing a 43 over or under? Like, what you have to understand is the nature of gap control and the nature of what assignments are dictated largely by where you're playing on defense, not whether it's a 34. So, you know, if you've got, like, I don't know, your run-of-the-mill standard 34 outside linebacker is going to be pretty similar on the weak side to your run-of-the-mill standard defensive end, maybe 10 pounds lighter, but in the modern NFL, maybe not, because your assignments are still relatively similar because you're usually lined up along the edge. And so there's differences, certainly, and you need to fit personnel along there, but there's plenty of guys that can kind of do both because it's really about your assignment as an individual defender, not necessarily what the overall defense is playing. I was asked, Rifleman asked, I don't think that Chris Johnson could expect to win Defensive Player of the Year if he misses too many games. Obviously, that's not an issue anymore. And so, you know, there was worry about, you know, him losing out on a lot of money. We'll talk about that shortly. And then cost himself a chance at Defensive Player of the Year. That's going to be, even missing 1 week can be tough, you know, when other guys rack up statistics during those weeks. But 16 games, if he has a good enough season, that's enough time to do it, certainly. Main Street Communications says, Seth, I'm a new subscriber and love your work. Thank you. The Chiefs could have had George Pickens last year, but instead traded down 4 picks and instead took Sky Moore. When are they going to admit that Veach, who's a very good GM, dropped the ball and give Rashee Rice, especially Justin Ross, the chance to become wide receiver too? Moore's fumble cost the Colts game last year, his drops, and Tony's cost the game against the Lions. How many more games are we going to let him cost us, especially when we have better options? Well, and I'll talk about this soon. We don't know if we have better options. We have unknowns, right? And it's important as fans to not get too caught up in the unknowns versus guys that have struggled in certain aspects. I'll talk about Sky Moore in a little bit here after looking at the film. You know, obviously, hindsight being what is, Pickens would have been a better pick. I think at the time I had kind of Moore and Pickens in the same tier. I had Pickens rated a little more highly, but it's not like I had him rated as like a first round or anything like that. But both of them were guys that I had relatively in the same area. But it is unfortunate in terms of, you know, anytime you look at opportunity cost, they could have drafted T. Higgins with the Clyde Edwards-Helaire pick. Veach has overall done a very good job, in my opinion. But you're always going to have misses. And unfortunately, a couple of his have stacked up at the wide receiver position. Um, Brian Butler asks, how did the offensive line do? I didn't hear Creed or Joe's name during the broadcast, so they must have done well. Overall, yes, they did pretty well. There was a lot of conversation about Jawan Taylor's, jump at the snap, which is something he's been doing his whole career. Lane Johnson does it too. Mitch Schwartz did it when he was in the league. Brian Bulaga talked about it on Twitter afterward. There was talk about him tipping plays. I think that's a big fat nothing burger for a variety of reasons, but mostly because players can't rely on necessarily tipped plays and rely on that exclusively, because if you get it wrong, you are in a huge amount of trouble, and people can always do things to try to mess with you and mix you up. So you got to be careful about tip plays type stuff. Aiden Hutchinson got a lot of well-deserved praise, and so a lot of people automatically assumed that must have meant Jawan Taylor got whooped. At least 3 of Hutchinson's pressures came when he was not going up against Taylor. He had some wins against Taylor one-on-one, but overall, I agree. Nate Tice with The Athletic actually put on Twitter a lot of Taylor versus Hutchinson's one-on-ones. For one thing, the Chiefs put him on an island against Hutchinson fairly frequently, and he did pretty well. He acquitted himself pretty well. I think overall, both of them gave and got in a really tough matchup, but I think Jawan Taylor had a bit of an edge overall, and that's the opinion Tice came to as well, and I tend to agree just when you watch every single snap. I think he looks good. I think he looks ready to go. The offensive line overall, I thought was fine. I thought was good. Donovan Smith had a few troubles, but he had some good snaps too. I don't think they were the primary issue there. I think the lack of continuity within the offense as a whole was a much bigger problem. But again, we'll get to that. Truth Tella, this is interesting. I guess that 38-17 prediction was a little off, sir. Overlooking an opponent I said will get you beat. Well, I guess my response to that would be, I don't think my prediction or my overlooking of the Lions probably had anything to do with the result, but maybe it did. It's hard to say. But yeah, absolutely got that completely wrong, and we'll get many other things completely wrong in the future. It's one of the beautiful things about this job is that even when you do your legwork, you're going to get things wrong just as often as you get them right. And yeah, that's just kind of how it goes. But no, hats off to you for, I assume you anticipated that that the Lions would win a relatively low scoring affair. Well done. Ball, my friend. Logan asks, if the recent Travis Kelce injury turns out to be more serious than initially reported, God forbid, or ends up being a season-ending injury, who do you think the Chiefs would look to bring in someone like Mike Evans to help replace his production? I think that would be tough, especially now with the 1-year thing that they've done with Jones. But I do think they would have to make some kind of move. Either that or they would just revamp the offense, and kind of like what I talked about last week in the newsletter, and as well as a little bit here about changing the offense up entirely, because you can't, and this is one of the things we'll talk about, you can't run the offense the same way without Kelce as you do with him. That's a ridiculous way to do business. And it's honestly doing not that entirely, because they mix some things up, but a little too much familiarity and acting as though it really is just next man up without Kelce, I think is part of what cost them on Thursday, because you can't ask Blake Bell to run the same routes Noah Gray would normally be running or Travis Kelce would be running. And that just is not going to work. And so that's a problem. So I do think they would have to either change up the way that the offense is structured or bring in someone. Yes. Which, all right, having talked about that, one of the first things I wrote about this week, so last week I wrote about Kadarius Toney, Sky Moore, and their drops. And it wasn't just a matter of drops. It was a matter of failed contested catches. Those things matter. And there were multiple really, really bad plays like that. The reality of that game is that had the Chiefs receivers caught, and this is tight ends, receivers, running backs. I think Pro Football Focus only credited, or I suppose debited them with 3 drops throughout the game. I disagree. I charted more like 6, but everyone's got a different standard for what constitutes a drop. Even some forms of contested catches I'll still view as a drop. So it's just, everyone's going to have a different standard for that. The thing that concerned me more, at least before I really rewatched every single snap, and I just saw a few snaps as examples, was some of the little jaggediness that the offense showed overall in terms of timing and spacing. That was something. And so this is a really easy example here. This was on an RPO, so it's a run pass option where Mahomes is reading a single defender, very very likely the linebacker or this linebacker here, and just basically, okay, are they going to leave the middle of the field open or are they going to follow Clyde? I'm guessing it's this linebacker, and so what you see here, though, these guys are running routes. They're not planning on just blocking. And yet, this is Sky Moore and Kadarius Toney. I'm not trying to just pick on those two guys, but it was them on this play. They ended up running into each other. This type of spacing issue is not something, even though you've got a defender who tries to push him out, generally speaking, you'd probably see Toney cut underneath here and then be probably a step or two ahead. And you'd have Moore probably going a little farther out here and kind of put layers against a zone look. Now, generally speaking, in an RPO, the ball is either getting handed off or it's coming to whoever's running this quick little slant here. Which again, I'm assuming based on alignment that it could be either one of them. So they've got a couple different concepts that they'll run here. Sometimes you'll have a guy like Toney run straight up the field, and then you'll have the slant cut in behind him. Sometimes you'll have the slant run in with then Moore coming in behind. I don't know which they called. I wasn't in the huddle, but that kind of spacing issue is something that we saw consistently. So what I did was, like I said, I went back and like I do every week, and I get to do that again. I'm excited about it. I charted Patrick Mahomes' snaps, charting things that genuinely look at what a quarterback does well. Obviously, we all saw the pick six. That's something that's going to affect Mahomes' QBR, his EPA per play, and all these really advanced stats that we really rely on to gauge quarterback play. A pick six that hit the receiver in the hands, that destroys some of those statistics. Right now I just saw someone sharing that Tyler Wilson had a better passer rating than Patrick Mahomes did. Well, how did drops affect that? More so, drop into a pick six is like your worst case scenario, right? And it's your most deceptive scenario when it's a good pass and the receiver just drops it. So that's why I go and I chart so by my charting, that was an accurate throw. It's not something that dings Mahomes by my charting. So while I did that, I took a look at every receiver and tight end that saw significant snaps. Sorry, Matt Bushman and Justin Ross. You didn't see enough snaps for me to really gauge anything. Shout out to Ross for catching his one target. Hope they get him more involved. But with the rest of the guys, I kind of watched them a little more closely just to see what was going on with them within the offense. Were they getting open? And because there were a lot of people talking afterwards, well, why was like on the first drive, especially Mahomes is looking down the field and has all kinds of time and he doesn't seem like he's finding anyone. So what was going on there? And so I found what I think are three issues. I'm going to cover those really quickly. If you want to read them, you can take a look at them on the Chief of the North newsletter. That's what we're going to be doing here every week is I'm going to be directing you to some of the stuff I'm already working on. So if it seems like I'm covering it quickly, you can find it on the newsletter, but hopefully it's informative for you guys too. Three main issues. The first was not enough of a changing of the game plan to account for Travis Kelce's absence. Blake Bell played 40% of the snaps. That's too many. Bell is fine as a blocker, and in emergency situations, you can tell him to run to a specific spot, and he'll generally catch the ball, but he's not going to create separation. He shouldn't be running option routes or doing any kind of sight adjustments, and the Chiefs had him on some plays running the types of routes that you'd see Kelce running normally. This is a concept that the Chiefs ran all the time last year with Noah Gray and Travis Kelce, with a tight end on each side, essentially almost utilizing them as slot receivers. And here you see that Blake Bell does not understand that he needs to continue to drift inside here. Mahomes tries to lead him in there. He only gets one hand on it, and it's a drop. See, I counted that as a drop because it was his poor adjustment that led to him only getting one hand on it. By the way, if you think, hey, Noah Gray looks like he's moving pretty well. Yes, he is. That's part of the good news. So what I saw was a little too much. They continued to try to use 12 personnel more than I would have, even using 13 personnel at times. And I understand that Kelce got hurt right after the game plan was installed. I would have loved to see them mix it up a little bit more. And I think that was part of some of the reason they had on a few snaps some timing and spacing issues is you're asking Blake Bell to be a guy that he's not. Noah Gray actually slid into Kelce's role better than Blake Bell slid into Noah Gray's role. Now, is Noah Gray even 70% of the player Kelce is? No, because basically no one is. But he ran good routes. He was generally where he was supposed to be. He did well in the second play, whereas Bell struggled with that enhanced role. And that's one of the problems that you get at a position like receiver or tight end. When you lose this top guy, people only think of the backup coming in for him. But when you've got a third stringer who is, and you've got a second string guy who normally sees a ton of snaps, that third stringer moves up too. And this is where you can have more problems often than this. The same thing exists with cornerbacks. If your top corner goes down, it's not so much about your second guy becoming the guy number one. Or even maybe your third guy becoming guy number two, if you're lucky, like the Chiefs have a lot of corners. But your fourth guy becoming guy number three, that's when you can start getting picked on and having problems. I think that happened to the Chiefs here. Issue number two, the Lions came in with a great game plan, and the adjustments went poorly at times. The Lions played a ton of man coverage last year. The Chiefs' route combinations early on especially looked like they were expecting more man looks, and the Lions played like 80% zone. That is something you're not going to see teams when Travis Kelce's healthy, or really when they're expecting it, I think, playing 80% zone against the Chiefs. Because if you play 80% zone against the Chiefs with Travis Kelce healthy, Kelce will catch approximately 20 balls for about 300 yards, or maybe more like 200, and just be a bunch of short dink and dunk all day. They took advantage of his absence with a really terrific game plan. And maybe they were going to mix things up that way anyway, but you could see that they weren't quite ready for it. And Marquez Valdes-Scantling's probably the Chiefs' most proven receiver by a fair amount, but he's not really a zone buster. He's more of a deep threat. And the Lions took advantage. And so one of the things with zone defense, when it's executed properly and guys pass off guys well, which they did, and you've got young receivers who maybe aren't as used to sight adjustments, and you've got route combinations being run that are maybe a little more designed to beat man coverage, you're going to see guys blanketed for 4, 5, 6 seconds because there's going to be guys in the throwing lanes. And that happened on way too many snaps. That's a really simple, basic thing, but I do think that was a problem for them. But it is one that I'd be shocked if that continued to be an issue moving forward, not just because of who Travis Kelce is, but because of who Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes are. The issue number 3, and this is one that I thought was kind of weird, is the Chiefs treated it like a hybrid preseason game. When you look at the snap counts you have here, you didn't have a single wide receiver getting more than 70% of the snaps. You had Sky Moore at 69%, Valdes-Scantling 63%. And then you had a bunch of guys, Richie James and Rashee Rice and Justin Watson and Kadarius Toney getting somewhere between 25 and 35% of the snaps. I think the Chiefs were somewhat in a fact-finding mode in this game, and it was weird. And I think it resulted in some of those spacing issues you see at times. Guys not maybe being in enough to get into a groove. It's one thing to see, 25% of the snaps when you're primarily a gadget guy or a niche guy. It's another thing to be one of the primary guys within the offense. You saw that with the running backs too. I'm not sure what Reid and company are doing there, but they really, in my opinion, should probably have 2 running backs that are doing the primary stuff and probably 5 wide receivers taking the vast majority of the snaps. You start rotating in too many guys, and I really do think even that one extra guy, I think you're asking for some problems with communication. And I think you saw that. All right, we are close to running out of time, and I haven't even gotten to Chris Jones yet. So here's what I'll do. You can check it out on the Chiefs of the North newsletter. I looked at every single pass catcher in order of snap counts. Noah Gray, Sky Moore, MVS, Blake Bell, Richie James, Rashee Rice, Justin Watson. You can see with Rashee Rice, that was one of the more fun ones. So I looked at all of them. Go check it out on the Chiefs of the North newsletter. Here's what I would say. Sky Moore's drops and Kadarius Toney's drops don't concern me all that much. Toney, people talk about separation numbers. He was running against zone, so that was more schemed than anything else. They're going to give him more shots. With Moore, what was more concerning to me is he did not look any different than how he did last year. So I'll just leave that at that. But Noah Gray and Rashee Rice both looked like guys that can do some things. Rice moved impressively a couple of times to adjust for zone looks. That was one of my favorite snaps. Was what at least it looks like it. With the way he breaks and with the route you see from James, you'd think that Rice is probably going to work his way across the back of the end zone here, but instead he seems to see where the defense is going, and you can see, I am so open. And then of course you saw on some other snaps where he demonstrated, I didn't have one of them, but you saw some other snaps where he really demonstrated some juice after the catch. And then of course Noah Gray, he ran good routes. He played well. He showed that he's able to break tackles like he did here. But he also showed a lot of comfort on that second play and adjusting to Mahomes. He looks more comfortable doing that this year. So I'm excited about those two guys. And, again, if Travis Kelce comes back in, suddenly you've got those guys slotted in as secondary weapons. MVS looked like himself. He's not a primary receiver because of the nature of the types of routes that he's good at and that he wins on. I do think the Chiefs need to dial him up as a primary read more often, though, because defenses generally respect the deep ball that allows him to create some separation on some intermediate looks. All right. Go check that out on the Chief North newsletter. I have a lot to say about all those guys. It's actually one of the longest pieces that I've written in a while. But Chris Jones, the details came out of from his contract. He's signed an extension, not an extension, sorry. He is with the Chiefs for this year. So basically, this is what we've got. Chris Jones comes back on a 1-year deal. He keeps the same base salary minus the game check he's already forfeited. $1 million for 35% playing time, $1 million for 50% playing time, 1.25 for 10 sacks, $500K for 15 sacks, $1 million for first team All-Pro and Super Bowl. It's the same thing, right? You need both to get that million, and $2 million for Defensive Player of the Year at Super Bowl. A Super Bowl title, mind you. Here's the deal. I am not going to go through all the math, which I did here. If you go to the Chief of the North newsletter, I posted that today. Here's the short answer here. And there's just a couple things I really want to note here. Jones started off with this deal $3.7 million in the hole because of the fines, because of missing the game check, right? When you look at those incentives, because he made this comment to a Twitter user or an X user, which I got my account temporarily locked on X for supposed it was a long thing. I'm not even gonna get into it, but that made me laugh. So if you're wondering why I'm not on Twitter today, that's why. Jones is saying, well, he got it all back. The thing is, he didn't. And I don't know a nicer way to say that, because when you look at those, he can get it back, but the only way he will get back that 3.7 million will be if he stays healthy. So he plays 50% of the snaps. That gets him to 2 million, right? But you still got 1.7 million to account for. Okay, we'll get 10 sacks in 16 games as a defensive tackle, something he's done twice in his career. And as we've talked about here a lot, sack numbers, especially for a defensive tackle, you can have the same pressure rate and you can have the same win rate year after year after year as a defensive tackle and see very different sack numbers. And we've seen that with Chris Jones. I've told people this a million times. Chris Jones was not a better pass rusher in 2022 than he was in 21, 20, or 19. His surrounding situation was better. And so some of those pressures, the quarterback didn't have anywhere to go, and they turn into sacks. And all that needs to happen is it needs to change on 4 or 5 plays, and suddenly you go from 9 sacks to 14 sacks, and that's why sack numbers can fool you a little bit. So let's say he gets to 10 sacks again. He's done that twice in 7-year career. He needs to do that to get to 3.25. He's still $500,000 short of where he would have been had he not sat out, and that's where if he gets 15 sacks, which is an incredibly hard number to reach, then he breaks even. So, and then I talk about $1 million. So the way he can make $3 million extra is first team All-Pro and Super Bowl appearance, Defensive Player of the Year, and a Super Bowl title. The chances of those things, as great as Jones is, some of those don't involve him, right? You need a Super Bowl appearance and a Super Bowl title for that $3 million. Injuries elsewhere could derail that. Bad luck elsewhere could derail that. All of those things. And just Defensive Player of the Year isn't enough. So he could be first team All-Pro and Defensive Player of the Year, but if the Chiefs lose in the divisional round because of an injury or whatever, that means he doesn't get any of that, and he's broken even after the holdout, after everything else, despite getting 15 sacks, despite Defensive Player of the Year. And he's broken even without getting the long-term contract that he was looking for, because that was his goal, and having to earn that. And so this is how I'm going to phrase it here. And again, I do the math in a lot of things, but I will just close out with this. Jones now has to earn through snaps, sacks, awards, and Super Bowls something that was free for him prior to the holdout overall, other than that last $3 million that's very unlikely to be earned. And how do I say this? It to me certainly appears that this was an enormous loss for Jones. He didn't get any long-term security. Now, he signed one big contract previously, but that's what he was looking for here, 3-year security. He has basically ended up exactly where he started off if he does things right. Not if his agents do anything for him, but if he does things correctly. He has to earn these things that he already would have had just walking in the door had he just played out that last year of his contract. Said, "Hey guys, thanks but no thanks. I'm just going to play out that last year." Everything would be the same except this potential 3 million that again requires a lot of luck as well as him being excellent. And I hope he achieves all of those incentives because that means the Chiefs won back-to-back Super Bowls, and that would be awesome for him. But that's really the long-term goal failed. He's burned some goodwill with fans, which I don't entirely blame Jones for this. This seems to be the advice that he was getting. And doing what I do in my day job, I'm very familiar with people acting based on bad advice. And generally speaking, I don't blame respondents or defendants, depending on which type of case you're doing for that. I blame the lawyer. I think I'm going to leave that at that. But the other thing, what he's lost here, he's lost that $54 million that was guaranteed, right? You sign the deal right now, the next 2 years, $54 million walking in the door. I get it. He wanted a little more. Fair enough. But now, this year, if something happens, if there's bad luck, you don't have that guarantee sitting there anymore. That's a bummer. That's an incredible amount of money. But he also lost the ability to negotiate at least this offseason. And now, next offseason, he'll be 29, turning 30. Whereas this offseason, he was 28, turning 29. That might seem like a small difference, but in the NFL, it's a pretty big difference. And he lost that ability. Finally, because of it's just a little bit different than it would have been. The franchise tag is just a little bit less. It'll probably be about $30.5 million to franchise him, at least based on the numbers I'm seeing. I've seen a few different ones. I trust Over the Cap for their number, but we'll see how that goes. The Chiefs could franchise tag him in theory and still kind of do something there because of that slightly lowered number. And so he lost long-term security. He lost a year of negotiation, which hurts leverage. And he lost some leverage off the franchise tag. Now he's got to prove it all over again. And that is not that is not what you go into that negotiation trying to win. He basically didn't win anything with this protracted holdout. And personally, I think that the way in which it was handled, like I said, I think I've said as much as I intend to on that subject, because I think sometimes people follow the advice that they are given, and that advice sometimes is quite poor, and you can see that in the results. That nothing really was won here. All right, that's what I've got time for this week. If you got any questions, any mailbag questions for next week, hopefully we're celebrating a Chiefs win. Please be sure to put them in the comment section below. Check out the Chief of the North newsletter. Next game is obviously on Sunday rather than a Thursday, so we'll be here Tuesday talking about whatever first article I'd written about and some of the other things that I'm looking at as the week goes along. I am excited to do this with you guys all season, and it is a great, great week to be a Chiefs fan.